At 6:41 p.m., the report was hand-delivered by Charles's lead oncologist, who steadfastly declined to discuss its specific contents with anyone other than the king himself. The revelations contained within those 17 pages have effectively sent the palace into crisis mode, forcing William to cancel all scheduled engagements through January. Simultaneously, these developments are raising uncomfortable questions about whether Great Britain might witness two royal deaths within mere months of each other. The central mystery remains regarding what specifically could have been contained within the king's confidential medical records to trigger such an alarm. This was the definitive report that fundamentally altered the trajectory of everything for the monarchy. The palace's family physician had requested a private audience with King Charles 3 days earlier, utilizing language that immediately signaled the severity of the situation to senior aides. This was clearly not a routine follow-up appointment, but rather a private audience intended to review some comprehensive assessment findings. Charles had been residing at Sandringham when the call came requesting his immediate return to London. He had been spending increasing amounts of time at the Norfolk estate in recent weeks, finding comfort in the relative privacy and the familiar routines that had sustained him through previous difficult periods. However, the journey back to Buckingham Palace on December 10th carried such a significant emotional weight that he simply could not ignore it. The meeting took place in Charles's private study, a room specifically designed for confidential discussions with thick walls and security measures that ensured absolute privacy. Dr. Hartley had arrived with 2 colleagues, both of whom were distinguished specialists in the field of advanced oncology. Charles had asked the Queen Consort, Camilla, to join him, as he knew he would need her strength for whatever news was coming. She sat steadfastly beside him as the family doctor opened the leather folder containing the critical assessment. The first few pages contained scanned images and technical data that meant little to Charles personally, but clearly carried immense significance for the medical professionals. Specifically, page 3 contained the executive summary that effectively changed everything for the royal family. Charles had asked Dr. Hartley to repeat the projected timelines, as he needed to hear them again to confirm what he thought he had understood. Either way, he was looking at a time frame sometime between March and August of 2012, meaning he likely would not see his next birthday in November. Camilla had gripped his hand tightly, her own face pale but composed in the way she had learned to be through decades of navigating public crises. She eventually asked the question Charles was still processing. Is there any possibility the assessment is incorrect, or any chance for better outcomes than these projections? The discussion that followed covered various treatment options, though possibilities was perhaps too generous a term for what remained available to him. The king could continue current protocols, accepting diminishing returns and increasing toxicity to buy maybe a few additional weeks or months of heavily compromised function. Alternatively, he could transition to palliative care, focusing on maintaining his quality of life for whatever time remained, rather than pursuing aggressive interventions. Such aggressive measures were deemed unlikely to meaningfully extend his survival at this stage. King Charles had specifically asked about his capacity to continue his royal duties under each potential scenario. This was the question that mattered most institutionally, the one that would determine how the next few months unfolded. not just for him personally, but for the monarchy itself. The conversation extended nearly 2 hours, with Charles asking detailed questions about anticipated symptoms, timelines, and his physical capabilities. When Dr. Hartley and his colleagues finally departed, leaving the comprehensive report for Charles to review at his own pace, the king sat in silence with Camilla for a long time. The winter evening had fallen dark outside, as the study's lamps cast a warm light that felt incongruous with the coldness Charles felt internally. He was 76 years old, had been king for less than 3 years, and was now being told his reign would be among the shortest in modern British history. The decisions Charles made that evening would determine how the monarchy navigated the most difficult transition it had faced in generations. He asked his private secretary to arrange an emergency meeting with William for the following morning. However, before retiring that night, Charles made one phone call that revealed exactly where his mind had gone. He reached out to Harry in California, catching his younger son in the early afternoon Pacific time. The conversation was brief, as Charles's voice steadied while he told Harry that medical news had taken a serious turn, and that if Harry wanted to see his father again, he should consider making arrangements to travel to the UK soon. As Charles prepared for bed that night, knowing sleep would be difficult, he thought about the profound irony of his situation. He had waited 73 years to become king, having spent his entire adult life preparing for a role that had seemed perpetually deferred. The king ascended the throne after his mother's passing in September 22, and had worked tirelessly to establish his reign as one of purpose and continuity. And now, barely 2 years later, he was facing the reality that his reign would be measured not in decades, but in months. It appeared that everything he had hoped to accomplish would remain tragically unfinished. The discrepancy between public statements about Charles's health and the medical reality he had been facing stretched back 18 months to a period when the king's diagnosis was still being characterized as treatable. The palace's first announcement in February 24 had described a form of cancer discovered during a routine procedure, with treatment beginning immediately, and the prognosis described as favorable. What the public had not been told was that Charles's condition had already metastasized by the time of the initial diagnosis. The discovery during a prostate procedure had not been the identification of early-stage localized issues, but rather the detection of disease that had spread beyond its original site. The favorable prognosis mentioned in palace statements had been based on best-case scenarios, rather than realistic assessments of what Charles was actually facing. From the beginning, his medical team had been managing an advanced condition with uncertain outcomes, not the manageable issue the public believed he was treating. Throughout the spring and summer of 24, palace statements continued to strike notes of cautious optimism, claiming the king was responding well to treatment. Each statement had been technically accurate in narrow terms while effectively obscuring the larger truth of the situation. The king was no doubt responding to treatment, but the response was partial and temporary. He was maintaining his schedule, but only through enormous effort and by hiding the extent of his fatigue and symptoms. He prioritized his health, but only within the constraints of institutional demands that allowed little genuine recovery time. The decision to manage public communication this way had not been made lightly by the administration. Senior palace advisors, in consultation with Charles himself, had weighed the consequences of full disclosure against the needs of institutional stability. A monarch revealing he had an advanced condition with an uncertain prognosis would create immediate questions about succession and his capacity to rule. The palace had chosen to emphasize hope and continuity, rather than acknowledge the precariousness of Charles's medical situation. However, the strategy had created its own problems, as they now faced the dilemma of how to acknowledge deterioration without admitting they had been misleading the public. The experimental treatments Charles had pursued, which were never mentioned in any public statement, reflected the desperation his medical team felt about conventional approaches. In June 2024, Charles had enrolled in a clinical trial for an immunotherapy designed to target his specific condition. The trial had required him to travel to a private facility in Switzerland, a journey explained to the public as a brief private retreat. The treatment had produced severe side effects and no measurable benefit, forcing Charles to withdraw from the trial after just 2 cycles. A second experimental approach in September had involved targeted radiation to specific sites, combined with a novel drug therapy that had shown promise in animal studies but limited human data. By November, Charles's medical team had been discussing openly among themselves what they had been reluctant to tell the king directly. The decision to finally order a comprehensive reassessment had come from Charles himself in late November. He had recognized his declining energy, his increasing discomfort, and his sense that whatever treatments were being administered were not working. He had requested that Hartley assemble a complete picture by consulting whatever specialists were necessary and provide him with an unfiltered assessment of where he stood medically. That request had led to 2 weeks of intensive evaluation that produced the devastating report delivered yesterday. The palace's communication strategy had been built on a fundamental tension between constitutional necessity and medical reality. A monarch's health was not merely a personal matter, but a deep institutional concern. Charles's capacity to fulfill his role affected the entire governmental structure. His prognosis impacted succession planning, diplomatic relationships, and national stability. The palace had believed that managing this information carefully was necessary for all those reasons. But in doing so, they had created a situation where the eventual disclosure would be more shocking and destabilizing than honesty from the beginning might have been. Senior staff who had been privy to the full medical picture throughout the 18 months now faced their own reckoning. They had participated in a sustained effort to present Charles's health more optimistically than facts supported. Some had felt uncomfortable with this from the beginning, but had deferred to the judgment of those above them. Others had convinced themselves it was justified, believing that protecting institutional stability outweighed obligations of transparency. Now, with Charles's passing potentially weeks away, those rationalizations felt increasingly hollow. The comparison to Queen Elizabeth's final years was inevitable. She had also faced declining health managed through careful public relations, with the palace never fully acknowledging how frail she had become until after her death. But Elizabeth had been 96, had reigned for 7 decades, and her decline had felt natural, even if its extent was hidden. Charles was 76, had reigned for only 2 years, and the revelation that he had been declining throughout most of that reign would raise questions about transparency. What palace insiders understood, even as they grappled with the ethical complexity of their approach, was that Charles himself had been complicit in the managed optimism. He had wanted to continue functioning as king for as long as possible. He had resisted acknowledging the full severity of his condition because acknowledgment would require stepping back from duties he had waited his entire life to assume. The palace had not deceived him, nor had they hidden information from their king. They had implemented a communication strategy Charles himself had approved, believing it served the greater good even at the cost of transparency. Now, with medical reality forcing decisions that could no longer be deferred, the palace faced the challenge of transitioning from managed optimism to managed acknowledgment of a terminal condition. The public would need to be told, and William would need to be prepared for imminent succession. The institution would need to begin the difficult work of explaining why they had spent 18 months suggesting Charles was fighting successfully when, in fact, he had been struggling almost from the beginning. The call reached Prince William at Adelaide Cottage at 7:15 on the morning of December 11th, less than 12 hours after Charles had received the report. William had been awake already, sitting at Catherine's bedside as she slept fitfully. His father's private secretary calling at this hour meant only one thing: the situation with Charles had deteriorated. The conversation was brief and carefully worded, conscious that even secure palace phone lines maintained records. William arrived at Buckingham Palace at 9:12. He told Catherine only that his father needed to discuss important matters, not wanting to add to her burdens when she was facing her own challenges. The children were at school, maintaining a routine that felt increasingly surreal as their family faced catastrophes that should have been years apart. Charles was waiting in his private sitting room, and William knew immediately from his father's expression that whatever had prompted this emergency meeting was as serious as he had feared. They embraced briefly, and William felt his father's frailty through his suit jacket, noticing how much weight Charles had lost even in the past few weeks. Then they sat, and Charles handed him a document marked with medical confidentiality headers. William opened and read the prognosis section twice, his hands tightening on the papers as he absorbed the timelines. 3 to 6 months without aggressive treatment, or 4 to 8 months of treatment that would make his father progressively less functional. Either way, William would likely be king before summer. "I am so sorry," William finally managed, his voice rough. "For you, for what this means, for your reign, for everything." Charles nodded, accepting the sympathy, but also clearly wanting to move to practical matters. They did not have time for extensive emotional processing. Decisions needed to be made about how to manage Charles's final months and William's imminent accession in ways that would not destabilize an already fragile institution. The meeting that followed brought in the king's private secretary, the Lord Chamberlain responsible for planning, the cabinet secretary representing government interests, and Princess Anne. The group assembled in the secure conference room where matters of highest constitutional sensitivity were discussed. The agenda that emerged over the next 4 hours covered territory the modern monarchy had never truly had to navigate. Charles's first major decision was about the timing of public disclosure. He could announce now that he was entering palliative care, preparing the nation for his approaching absence while he still had the capacity to shape the narrative. Alternatively, he could continue as long as physically possible, making the announcement when decline became impossible to hide. The second decision involved William's formal assumption of royal responsibilities. The traditional arrangement when a monarch was incapacitated involved appointing counselors of state to perform certain functions. But Charles' situation went beyond temporary incapacity. He was dying, and William needed to begin functioning as king in all but name well before the actual accession. The lawyers outlined a plan for William to grant him unprecedented authority to act on the king's behalf, effectively making him co-regent during Charles's final months, and raised the complication everyone had been thinking about but no one had wanted to articulate. William's wife is also under close care. We are asking him to prepare for kingship while managing Catherine's final months and supporting 3 grieving children. The practical question is whether any human being can handle that simultaneous load. William's response surprised those who did not know him well, but made perfect sense to those who did. "I have to handle it because there is no alternative," he stated firmly. "The institution needs a functioning heir. My children need a present father. Catherine needs her husband, and my father needs his son. None of those needs disappear because they are inconvenient or overwhelming. So I do what is necessary, and I figure out how to cope with the rest later." It was the kind of stoic pragmatism the royal family had always demanded, but hearing it articulated by someone facing such impossible circumstances made several people in the room visibly emotional. The practical arrangements that flowed from that determination were extensive. William's schedule would be restructured to allow maximum time with Catherine while still fulfilling essential duties. Staff would be increased to handle the administrative work William had previously managed himself. Mental health support would be quietly arranged, though William made clear he would not have time for extensive counseling until after he had navigated the immediate crisis. Crucially, George's education and preparation would be accelerated. By early afternoon, the emergency planning session had produced a comprehensive framework for the next 6 months. Charles would continue as king, but with diminishing public presence. William would assume increasing responsibilities under formal delegated authority. The palace would prepare for the accession, which could occur any time from March onward, with all necessary protocols ready to be activated within hours of Charles's passing. The family would attempt to maintain some semblance of normal function while navigating dual dying processes that made normal function almost impossible. As the meeting concluded and participants dispersed to begin implementing decisions, Charles asked William to remain behind. Father and son sat together in the now empty conference room, and Charles said what he had needed to say before the machinery of constitutional preparation consumed them both. "I am sorry you have to face this, and sorry I won't be there to support you as king." William could only embrace his father and acknowledge that the apology, while meaningful, could not change the reality they both faced. The crown would pass from father to son far sooner than either had wanted, in circumstances neither could have imagined. Camilla had been queen consort for less than 2 years, a title she had waited decades to hold and had fought through extraordinary public hostility to achieve. The coronation in May 20 had been her vindication, the moment when she finally stood beside Charles as his official partner, rather than the controversial figure blamed for the collapse of his first marriage. She had built a role for herself, had won gradual public acceptance, and had begun to see a future where she could serve meaningfully. The medical report delivered yesterday had effectively destroyed that future in 17 pages. Camilla would be queen consort for perhaps 6 more months before becoming queen dowager, and the crown she had worn for such a brief time would pass to Catherine. Everything Camilla had worked toward and endured public scorn to achieve was being cut brutally short by a condition that respected neither titles nor years of patience. Her private grief was complicated by institutional considerations that immediately demanded attention. As queen consort, Camilla held positions and patronages that would need to transition after Charles's passing. The properties she currently occupied would revert to the crown. Income streams would change dramatically, and most painfully, her entire social and official position would shift from consort to widow. The financial implications alone were staggering, as Camilla had no significant independent wealth. She had lived comfortably as Duchess of Cornwall on income from the Duchy of Cornwall, then even more comfortably as Queen Consort on income from the Duchy of Lancaster. But those incomes were not personal property, they were attached to roles. When Charles passed away, Camilla would lose access to most of the financial resources she had become accustomed to. Provisions existed for queen dowagers, but they were far more modest than what any sitting queen consort enjoys. The palace's legal team had arranged meetings with Camilla throughout the day following Charles's receipt of the medical report, outlining what her situation would look like. She would retain a grace and favor residence, likely on royal estates, but certainly not at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. She would receive an allowance sufficient for a comfortable life, but nothing approaching royal scale. She would maintain certain honorary positions, but would lose most of her active royal role. In essence, she would be pensioned off, set aside with dignity, but firmly removed from the center of royal life she had fought so hard to occupy. What hurt most was not the financial diminishment or even the loss of position, but the speed with which the institution was prepared to move her aside. Within hours of learning, Charles had months to live. Palace machinery had begun processing Camilla's transition from essential to auxiliary. She understood the constitutional necessity and understood that William would need to establish his reign without the complications of his father's widow maintaining a high-profile presence. But understanding did not make it less painful to feel the institution preparing for her irrelevance before Charles was even gone. Her relationship with William had always been complicated, cordial, but never warm, marked by his loyalty to Diana's memory. Now that relationship would determine much of Camilla's future. If William chose to be generous, she could maintain dignity and some meaningful connection to royal life. If he chose to distance himself from her, she could find herself increasingly isolated, a reminder of his father's reign that the new king preferred to minimize. The conversation Camilla had with William on December 11th, after his emergency meeting with his father, was one of the most difficult of her life. William had been direct, not cruel, but firm, outlining what he expected from Camilla during Charles's final months and after his passing. She would support his father with dignity and discretion. She would not create complications or demand attention that would distract from the transition William needed to manage. And critically, she would understand that the new reign would need to establish its own identity, which meant Camilla stepping back rather than trying to maintain influence. Camilla had agreed to everything William asked, partly because she had no leverage to do otherwise. She also agreed because she genuinely wanted what was best for the institution she had married into, and because she loved Charles enough to not complicate his final months. But the agreement felt like negotiating her own obsolescence, accepting that her brief time as queen consort would be followed by a long period of graceful irrelevance. She worried about who would care for Charles in his final months. Palace protocol and medical requirements would surround him with doctors and staff, but she wondered if he would have the emotional comfort he needed. The children from both their previous marriages added another layer of complication. Camilla's children, Tom and Laura, had been supportive throughout her relationship with King Charles, but had never fully integrated into royal life. They would be peripheral to the mourning process, acknowledged but not central. William and Harry had their own relationship with their father, independent of Camilla, and she had no illusions that they needed her comfort. One conversation Camilla had with Charles the day after receiving the report revealed the depth of her anguish as she told him she felt cheated that their time was being cut so short. The phone call reached Harry at 3:14 in the morning, California time, the hour when emergency notifications feel most ominous. He had been sleeping poorly anyway, troubled by news reports about Catherine's health and by his own conflicted feelings about family estrangement. Charles's private secretary was calling, which in itself was significant. Communications from the palace typically came through formal channels or, when necessary, through intermediaries. Direct contact meant something serious. Something that could not wait for business hours or proper protocol. The message was delivered with professional courtesy that barely masked its urgency. His Majesty wished to speak with the Duke of Sussex at his earliest convenience, preferably immediately. Harry, still foggy from sleep, understood this was not a request for an eventual conversation. This was his father saying he needed to talk now, and the implication was that time might be shorter than anyone outside the immediate family understood. Harry said he would call back within 15 minutes, needing a moment to fully wake and prepare himself for whatever he was about to hear. The conversation with his father lasted only 11 minutes, but conveyed everything Harry needed to know. His father was declining, and the medical report had been definitive. If Harry wanted to see his father again, to have any chance at reconciliation or goodbye, he needed to come to England soon. Charles's voice had been steady, but carried an exhaustion Harry had not heard before, the sound of someone who had accepted terrible news. Harry's response had been immediate. "I will book the first available flight. I can be there by tomorrow evening, London time." Charles had thanked him, said nothing about their estrangement, and simply expressed quiet gratitude that his younger son would come. Meghan's response to Harry's announcement that he was leaving immediately for London was complex. She understood Harry needed to see his father and supported his decision intellectually, but she also recognized this trip would reignite media interest in their relationship with the royal family. It would position Harry back within a family dynamic he had worked hard to escape. They had built a life in California, premised on independence from the institution that had made them miserable. The conversation Harry had with Megan in the pre-dawn hours as he hastily packed touched on questions they had been avoiding. Would Harry attend his father's funeral whenever that came? And would the children be expected to participate? Would Harry's presence in the UK during Charles's final months create expectations of reconciliation with William that neither brother was prepared for? The flight Harry managed to secure through a contact departed Los Angeles at 9:30 a.m. on December 11th. The 13-hour journey would put Harry in London around 2 p.m. on December 12th. Charles's private secretary had arranged for discreet arrival protocols, bringing Harry directly to Clarence House without the usual security circus. The goal was to give father and son time together without immediate media intrusion. The question weighing on Harry throughout the flight was what he would say to his father, and whether any conversation could address the years of conflict. Harry had spent the past 4 years justifying his departure from royal life publicly. However, the question of timing was also haunting Harry as his flight crossed the Atlantic. Would he arrive in time, or would the stress of recent events accelerate the decline? Harry drafted a letter on his phone during the flight, words he wanted to say, but worried he might not be able to articulate. The plane began its descent toward London at 1:40 p.m. on December 12th, and Harry looked out the window at the gray city he had fled 4 years earlier. Meanwhile, the scenario planning session, held at Windsor Castle on December 12th, brought together senior advisors to address a question no one had seriously contemplated until now. What happens if both King Charles and Catherine, Princess of Wales, pass away within weeks of each other? The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple. Charles had been given 3 to 6 months, and Catherine's prognosis was estimated to be on a similar timeline. Both could pass away in late winter or early spring, potentially within weeks of each other. If that happened, Britain would face the unprecedented situation of a new king assuming the throne while in mourning for his wife. He would be raising 3 grieving young children while managing national loss on a scale not seen since the aftermath of Diana's death. The practical questions multiplied rapidly regarding William's ability to perform necessary public duties. Could he address the nation and meet with government officials if he were simultaneously managing Catherine's final days? Would George, as heir apparent at age 11, need to participate in ceremonies typically reserved for adults? How would the monarchy maintain stability when the king himself was in a personal crisis that would incapacitate most people? The discussion that followed was uncomfortable for everyone involved. William was respected and capable, but everyone had limits. Watching your wife pass away while preparing for kingship stretched beyond what anyone should be expected to handle. The contingency being discussed involved essentially creating a shadow regency where William would be king in name while others managed actual governance. The public communications challenge was equally daunting. How does a nation mourn a king it barely knew while preparing for his successor's ascension? Under tragic circumstances, Charles had reigned for less than 3 years, hardly enough time to establish the kind of relationship Elizabeth had built. His passing would generate genuine sadness, but also immediate focus on what came next. What came next? Was William becoming king in circumstances that would make the coronation feel more like a funeral than a celebration. The impact on George, Charlotte, and Louis demanded a separate discussion. Specialists advocated for shielding the children from public demands, allowing them to grieve privately. But that approach conflicted with royal tradition that required visible family presence during major transitions. The compromise being developed involved minimal, age-appropriate public appearances for the children. The question of Harry's role added another complication, as he would inevitably be present for the funeral if he was already in the UK. Protocol would require his inclusion in family mourning, but his estrangement from William would create tension. The planners were preparing for scenarios where Harry attended but remained separate from core royal activities. By the time the December 12th planning session concluded, the group had produced comprehensive frameworks for managing these theoretical worst-case scenarios. However, the frameworks could not address the human dimension of what the monarchy would face. An institution already struggling with questions of relevance would be asking the nation to mourn a barely known king while supporting a new king in a personal crisis. The children at the heart of succession would be traumatized, the family would be fractured, and the crown itself would face questions about its future. Princess Anne, closing the session, offered a final assessment that captured what everyone was thinking. The room fell silent as her words settled over the group. This was not just constitutional planning. It was preparing for a potential crisis that could fundamentally alter or even end the monarchy as Britain had known it.